Welcome everyone to the Committee of 100's Zoom webinar. Thank you all for joining. We'd like to start the webinar with our moderator, Maylee Tom, C100 member, who will be moderating today's three
Welcome everyone
discussions.
To the committee.
Good evening. On behalf of Committee of 100, I'm so honored to be your host for this special program featuring three Chinese American role models who've dedicated their careers in elected office serving the 5th largest economy in the world and the most populous state in the country, California. Our featured guests are Betty Yee, California State Controller, John Chung, the former State Treasurer of California, and the first Asian American male to run for governor, and Assemblyman Evan Lowe, who made a name for himself by being the youngest Asian American to ever be elected to public office. We're going to try to get a glimpse of what motivated them to go into public service and run for office. And we also like to examine their thoughts, that's what's affecting Chinese Americans today in this country. Our first guest is Betty Yee. And I have to tell you, I've watched her career since the time she came in as a distinguished Senate fellow in the California legislature and saw her career soar as she became one of the most widely respected budget expert in the state of California. She has been a state constitutional officer since 2014, which included 2 terms of elected service on the California Board of Equalization before her election to state controller. I'm proud to say that she's also one of the most respected women in state government today. And right now, she is the 10th woman in California's history to be elected to statewide office. She's our pride and joy. Welcome, Betty.
Thank you, Maylee.
I'm going to be asking this question of all of our guests today. And the first one is, what inspired you, Betty, to seek a career in politics?
You know, Maylee, I think it's really important to distinguish what we read about as politics in the paper every day as compared to what I believe really the purpose of politics is. And, we obviously read about the rough and tumble of politics, and, sometimes it's corrupt and it's kind of power grabbing and just a lot of noise around politics. But I think fundamentally, the root of politics is really about people. And, how do you bring about a diverse array of voices of people to really try to tackle some of the most daunting challenges that we have facing us today? And so, I have a very optimistic view of what politics means. And really what got me interested was from the very personal level. I'm a daughter of immigrants, and my parents didn't have high educational attainment and certainly no English language proficiency. And I think for children of immigrants, and particularly, when you look at the state of California today, where we have a majority minority, it is, really a common experience for the children of immigrant parents to be advocates. We're interpreting, we're translating, we're interfacing with government, and interfacing with just so many aspects of authorities in their lives. And, when you stand up for, people like that, I think that's really what the root of politics is just to be sure that, those voices can be represented and heard, and certainly be part of whatever solutions are brought about. So, that was really my interest. It was my upbringing as a daughter of immigrants, and my public service really became about, how do we grow, those voices, whether it be in representation, when we didn't have anybody that looked like me in the legislature. And Maylee, you were one of the pioneers really at the staff level, really advocating for the fact that we needed to really start to, build that interest, build that bench, and starting with our young people. And I'm just happy to say that we're seeing now Asian Americans serving at all levels of government throughout our country.
Well, you have an amazing story, Betty, and so much courage. in that as an Asian American running for state office, your challenge when you ran for state controller was facing one of the most powerful political figures in California at that time, who was the former speaker, John Perez.
Yeah.
And I know it was daunting because people considered you the underdog. Actually, a lot of times they consider Asian Americans always the underdog.
Right, exactly.
How did you handle that challenge? Because it was, to me, it was such a proud moment because it was such profiles and courage.
You know, I have to say, and you nailed it, I think, Mei Li. I think anytime, certainly when I am considered an underdog, you just work that much harder to, really disprove that. And certainly worked very hard on that campaign. But, when I think about just putting myself out there as an Asian American woman, and certainly for an office like controller, where so much of it is about, finances, about, fiscal policy, and that's been my background. And so I felt very, very qualified to run for the office. And I think, the stereotypes all kind of came to surface. Asians are good at math. So I think people kind of had a comfort around the fact that, as an Asian woman, that I probably was qualified to do the job. I will say that I face many more challenges running as a woman. I think certainly when we talk about fundraising, when we talk about just the depth of my network as a woman, I built professional networks over the course of my then 30 plus year career, but certainly it wasn't as deep as what many of the networks of men are when they run for office. And so I would say that was definitely one of the challenges. And then when I think about just what's really required to be successful at running for office, so it's not just raising the money, getting endorsements, really making a case for your qualifications, and I think what really was successful for me was just putting my qualifications out there. I've been doing this work for well over 3 decades, and I think that experience at the end of the day really was what the voters ended up voting for.
And I also saw in you, Betty, that you were undaunted. I mean, there were so many times where some people even tried to discourage you, and you were just so persistent. And a lot of times people are not used to Asian Americans being so persistent.
That's true.
Really became one of the most respected Asian women or women in the state of California. It's because how well you did with this challenge. All of us are so proud of it. I think a very critical issue faces our nation and our state at this time. And as a statewide Asian Pacific American leader, how has your perspective changed during this time when we are fighting a global pandemic, facing the impacts of the pandemic-induced recession, and while at the same time witnessing the growing voices for racial equity and justice?
It is probably, it will go down as one of the most unprecedented times in history, where we have a convergence of essentially 3 crises. And I think, I would say that my perspective as an Asian American leader, and I think for my colleagues as well, oftentimes we pride ourselves as being the most knowledgeable one in the room. We study hard on what we're expected to know, and to really have the facts and figures, and really prepared to just tackle whatever challenge is before us. And I would say during this time, certainly my perspective has changed with respect to really being now more prepared to go into a room and being able to admit that we don't have the answers, and that this is a time where it's okay to feel vulnerable because the answers aren't easy. This public health crisis that we are facing with the novel coronavirus, we're learning new things about it every day still. And when we get to the other side of this pandemic, there will still be challenges. With this recession, we know that every sector of the economy has been affected. We've had close to 9 million people in California alone apply for unemployment benefits. And so when I think about what every public official will be expected to do, each of us will be required to be part of how we rebuild this economy. And then when I think about crisis really that's been boiling, I think, for a very long time around racial justice. So much of this just begins with, our own perspective about who we are as Asian Americans. What are the things that we have experienced with respect to our own feelings of injustice and prejudice and discrimination against us. And how does that inform us in terms of the larger, perspective about other communities and learning other communities' history and sharing ours as well. And really, this is a time where I think there are no easy answers. It's a time when we know that the path is not going to be charted for us. We're going to be charting new paths on our own. It will be a time when I think more and more what I've learned is that to navigate these crises really requires much more honesty, even if the honesty is about just saying, I don't have the answers. And probably most significantly, our leadership is going to have to be one that has to be inclusive. I think part of the outcry for racial justice and equity is the fact that so many communities have been excluded. And I think when we think about our own communities' experiences with that in our history and begin to look at the experiences of, Black Americans or Latinos, it becomes very clear that so many of our policies have really encouraged exclusion rather than inclusion. And so I think that's really our work and our calling going forward is that, our leadership has to be inclusive and it also has to be decisive. So as much as we don't know the answers, we have to probably just take the best information we have at any given point in time and just be decisive. We will make mistakes, but I think that's all part of being honest about the fact that, we do the best with what we have in terms of information. We try to make the best decisions possible to ensure the health and safety and opportunities for everyone. And we're not going to always get it right at the first turn. So it's a very uncertain time, but I think with that can also still be resolute leadership that is about how we guide certainly our constituents through the crises and with the most honesty and transparency possible.
Betty, I'm following up on that question. Some people are not aware of what the duties are of the state controller. And
Yeah.
I know that you're the chief fiscal officer, but also how does your role as a state controller impact what they're facing, what California is facing now with regards to the pandemic budget?
Absolutely. So as the controller, I am the independent fiscal watchdog for the state. So essentially the CFO for the fifth largest economy. And in that role, I'm responsible for paying the bills for California, obviously monitoring the state's cash to be sure that there's sufficient resources to pay the bills. I issue the financial statements for California. I'm responsible for payroll for over 280,000 state employees and employees of our California State University system. We do all of the financial reporting, as I said, all the disbursements, millions of disbursements a year. But I would say, really where we've had the broadest reach in terms of my office is that just by virtue of my office, I have a seat on about 70 different boards and commissions that have influence over a public pension policy. I serve as a trustee on both the California Public Employees Retirement System Board, as well as the California State Teachers Retirement System Board. I'm also a member of the State Lands Commission, which has jurisdiction over the management of our state lands and tideland resources, and also chair of the Franchise Tax Board and still serve as a fifth voting member of the Board of Equalization. So the reach on policy is quite broad. But in terms of my influence on these issues, clearly being sure that we have the resources to continue to operate and to really serve the people of California during this time when our budget is very, very stretched thin. Tax revenues are down for all states, for all of our local governments. And so just being sure that we have sufficient resources to still meet our critical needs. With respect to the issues of racial equity and justice. I think this is really something that we're all tackling in our personal lives and our professional lives. But for me, particularly during this pandemic, which has had us all looking at different ways that we're working remotely for many of our team members now, how we continue to stay connected and how do we promote an inclusive workplace when we're all working from different locations and being sure that we are staying connected. But I think one thing the pandemic has taught us, Maylee, whether it's in our personal lives or in our professional lives, that we really are so dependent on one another in terms of our health and safety. So in order to really take care of others, we have to take care of ourselves. And so this is something that I think is going to probably be transcendent with respect to what not only happens in our personal lives, but also how we continue to lead in our workplaces.
I see, unfortunately, our time is going quickly because we have two other guests, but I still have some questions here that I'd like to ask you that being asked by. One is by Ivan Yeo, who says, I think he's saying, what do you think about the Asian representation so far at the DNC, meaning probably the convention, Betty?
Yes. I've been attending quite a bit of the the events at the convention. I think we're seeing really a lot more participation by the AAPI community. And much of that has to do with having elected many more representatives at all levels of our government. Certainly from in the United States Senate to in our halls of Congress and the House of Representatives, all of our states, and certainly with respect to our local governments and school districts. So, we're the fastest growing, minority population, and I think certainly our voting power and strength is continuing to grow. And so I actually am very hopeful about the fact that we are not going to be a forgotten community when it comes time for hopefully a new administration to think about appointments to its administration, to think about the issues that really have been, that have created disparities in our community compared to others. And so I'm very hopeful about the future of the AAPI community with respect to national politics.
I'm going to follow up on that question by Amy C. Um, would you speak on the demands for inclusive measures, quotas, in school admissions when the measures adversely affect Asian admissions? And I think she's saying in Washington and California and in New York. And this is a question from Amy C.
This may have to do with the with affirmative action and quotas and just the how Asians may be represented with respect to admissions to colleges. So I'm going to actually cite a point that one of my colleagues, who I just have tremendous respect for here in California, our state senator, Dr. Richard Pan, who's a pediatrician. And I know that when the measure Assembly Constitutional Amendment 5 was before the Senate, he really argued in favor of it, and I also support it. And I don't believe that it actually means that it harms our API community. In fact, I think it actually broadens opportunities. The issue here was whether California should lift the constitutional ban on affirmative action. And this would be with respect to admissions to higher education or just education generally, with respect to opportunities for state public contracting, and so all these things with respect to employment, and I would say that what I really have seen, I served on the Cal Alumni Association at UC Berkeley, my alma mater, and what we've seen over the years is that we really have had so many minority communities turn away from our higher education institutions in California because they don't see many of themselves on campus. And so they tend to go to other campuses where they see more of a supportive community for them. And we also, and what Dr. Pan said when this issue came to the fore was, look, higher education is one aspect, but we don't see many AAPI CEOs. We don't see many AAPI directors of medical schools. I mean, we're setting a ceiling for ourselves if we think that higher ed admission is the end all be all, because there's a whole world beyond higher education where we hope our children can continue to ascend and really reach those higher levels of leadership. And so this is what we're really fighting for, because we actually are limiting ourselves, and we're also hemorrhaging talent, because we aren't looking at the ability to consider race and ethnicity in the decisions that we make about hiring, with respect to admissions, with respect to and by the way, it's about women as well. Many of this talent is actually going outside of California.
And one last question I'm going to ask you before I let you go, Betty, because I know you have another speaking engagement. Any long-term aspirations? Because I see more things in store for you, Betty. And I wonder if you yourself have any other long-term aspirations.
I do, Maylee, and it's what I would say is I enjoy what I do. I have had a commitment to public service and will continue to do so. And I think many know about my aspirations. I would be honored to be the first Asian woman governor of California. But there are many paths to get there. And so, but I'm going to continue to serve. I have a commitment to serve, and I think when I look at where I can best, really just bring my my discipline and to make a difference for people, I definitely think that certainly being governor, maybe U.S. senator, I'm just going to have to assess, what position really allows me to continue to apply my discipline and to have the broadest impact on people's lives.
I think you have the widest horizon, Betty, for what you've accomplished. And thank you for taking the time to join us with this program. And good luck to you, Betty.
Thank
Nice.
you, Meili. Wonderful to join you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Now we will hear from former California State Treasurer, John Chang.
Hi, John.
Hey,
John,
great to see you.
great to see you too. John's no stranger to Committee of 100 being a member. And, but John probably hasn't told you about his successful career when he was a state elected official. So I'm going to brag about it. You know, John has won 10 statewide elections during his 16 years in public office, starting on the State Board of Equalization to state controller and subsequently to state treasurer. And during his term in statewide office, and I've heard this so often, he gained a reputation as one of the most trustworthy elected officials among all California voters. And even though John had another 4 years, say 4 years to run for state treasurer, he threw his hat in to run for governor in 2018 because he felt it was really time to demonstrate that Asians must not be satisfied to just have a seat at the table. He feels that Asians should be at the head of the table, and that's why he decided to run for governor. And even though he did not win, he, like Andrew Yang, forever changed the image of Asian Americans to show that we are unafraid to compete for the top seats of government. So I'm glad you're here, John. Welcome.
Great to be with you.
I'm going to ask everybody the same question. I want to know your aha moment when you decided you wanted to go into a career of public service and politics, especially knowing that your mom loves doctors.
So it was just the natural progression of my life. Being in my late 50s, I was born in the early 1960s at a time of great tumult for the United States of America. My parents were immigrants who came to this country like so many others with very little. My dad, 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, trying to learn his 5th language, English, to get his PhD in chemical engineering. My mom scrubbed floors to pay for her English lessons. So I was born in New York, but grew up in suburban Chicago. And at the age of 6 or 7, I started to feel the discrimination. Our family was taunted, rocks breaking through our windows, ugly racial epithets, spray painting, go home gook, Jap, chink, just showing the ignorance because they didn't even know what ethnicity, what our heritage was. So early on, I was interested, in part because I went back with my mom one summer, visited my grandfather, who was an attorney, prosecutor, an accountant, auditor for the county government. And he was paid by one of his private sector clients with chickens. And I just thought that was cool. I want to be a lawyer. I want to help poor people get paid with chickens. But later on, as I faced more tumult, I wanted to be Thurgood Marshall or be like Thurgood Marshall. I wanted to argue cases before the United States Supreme Court that would have an impact on Asian Americans to give us dignity, to give us decency, to give us respect under the laws of the United States of America, as we should receive as with all other Americans.
I know a lot of people are always interested in what motivates Asian Americans to run for office. And I know you always had that commitment to public service. You know, you've had 2 decades of experiences managing state finances. And what do you foresee as the greatest economic problems facing California as a result of this pandemic?
Well, we are experiencing deep, profound dislocation. We were facing it before, and it's not just California, it's the United States of America. In fact, it's been discussed at Committee of 100 annual gatherings. China and the United States have big Gini coefficients. The disparity between the wealthiest earners in the respective countries and those who are lower income. And that has a devastating impact on the progress of a society. We need our state, national, international leadership to come together at these times. Healthcare outcomes are terrible. We have broken technology systems where people can't get the basic aid they need to pay for their electricity, to pay for their rent. We need to address the upcoming eviction crisis. You can't have, and we already have, staggering homelessness and housing issues in the state of California. We need all our leaders to set aside their differences and recognize as a basic human, the basic human condition that we need to take care of our fellow brother and sister to make sure that they have lives that don't put them in harm's way, that don't put them in pain, that don't put them in suffering.
I want to follow up on that question in terms of issues that are critical, not only facing California, but while you were in office, John, did you have a chance to address issues that you felt impacted the members of C100?
Oh, Maylee, you led one of those most important efforts that the United States is following after, what we pushed at CalPERS and CalSTRS, the nation's two largest public defined benefit plans. When you were my deputy, my representative on the powerful CalPERS, CalSTRS board, you said, hey, John, why don't we push our colleagues and this agency to recognize that America has extraordinary talent in its incredible diversity, in its people of color, in its gender, in its orientation, in its faith, in its skill set. So you had me send that letter to my colleagues saying, we need more people of color helping to lead the private sector, right? We both of us and others have long fought to bring diversity into public governance, but we need that private governance to make sure, right? Asians have oftentimes been left behind because we don't have enough private sector leadership. So we sent out that letter and then we pushed for more women on corporate boards. You left me to become you were at the outset a great grandma, but to focus more on family after, your incredible service lifting the Asian Pacific community here in the state of California, right? But I pushed for members of the LGBTQIA community to sit on corporate boards. And then when I was back at a United Nations gathering, there was a meeting held by the permanent ambassador to the United Nations from France. And we're talking about climate risk. And I said, hey, why don't we push for more climate risk experts on corporate boards? So I went to Jack Enos, who's heads CalSTRS, and I said, Jack, I'm thinking about bringing this idea to the CalSTRS board. You think, would there be any opposition by staff? And he said no. And I said, I'm going to invite Betty to co-sign this letter with me. So Betty wanted to draft a letter. I give her kudos. So we sent that letter. And so that's how we're trying to bring America forward, leading, hopefully, our planet in better practices, including talent management.
John, in fact, you realize that your successors to both of your positions as state controller and state treasurer are Chinese American women. So talk about paving the way for Asian Americans. I mean, you have that record. You're the first Asian American male to run for governor, John. And I want to know if you could share some of the challenges you face as an Asian American and other challenges, and would you have done something or anything differently?
Yeah, so I will frame it in the context, which I think C100 members and the organizations and others who are interested in running for office can use. Tomorrow we have a meeting for those who can participate, a C100 members meeting, right, to talk about a project. I don't know if it's confidential or not, so I won't engage, right? But when we have to push our narrative to make sure that people understand it's part of the American story. It's part of the deep fabric. When you think about Supreme Court cases as to who is a United States citizen or who has right to a public education, you had pioneer Chinese, now Chinese Americans, who had to fight for that right. And oftentimes people from other communities, other backgrounds, don't know that was a struggle that our community also endured and fought and led to make America more inclusive, to represent the one America. Now, what's important, and that we see it with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, is that you have to strike the right tone, and with the proper intensity at a particular given time. One of my shortcomings is as a prominent political official here in California said, John, they go, you're too knowledgeable. You go into the rabbit hole. You fix problems, right? You're a great problem solver. Right where America was during my gubernatorial election, and I heard it from, some others, is you got to be angry at Donald Trump, right? For me, I've been angry at racists all the time and bigots and others, right? So and I'm not just speaking of Donald Trump, I'm talking about throughout society and the people we watch at Charlottesville and elsewhere. And so, yes, right, that's why my public career was dedicated to building a more inclusive America. But I wanted to come up with real solutions, the solutions that we talk about and needed today. How do you get all people, especially those who are impacted, the social determinants of healthcare, how do you get them access to healthcare? Why I started a program on free income tax services for the state of California, right? Because I wanted to make sure the $2 billion that was left with the federal government gets into the pocketbooks of struggling low-income Californians who need to put food on their table and to pay for their electricity bill and to pay for their rent. So as C100 and its members go forward on our messaging, we have to make sure that we can decide to be like Black Lives Matter, keep consistent messaging and hoping the moment reaches, or to make sure that we're smart and figure out how to assimilate those messages and values into social media, into entertainment programming, so it becomes more mainstream and they hear our second story. Second point, when we did our polling, this is part of our issue. Our leaders need to stand up and speak out more. Asian Americans aren't viewed as leaders generally because we're not seen sufficiently. Now we're starting to raise the ceiling, but we really need to crash through that ceiling. And I know a lot of the earlier generation have worked hard and struggled and wanted the best for their kids. But if you won't stand up and fight, you're going to put a low ceiling on the possible achievements of future generations of Americans as to whether they can be top elected officials, whether they can break through in the entertainment industry, where they are generally recognized in commerce, right? We have, if you look at the membership of C100, very, very successful, the commercial endeavors and the pioneers who have led those companies, right? But you don't see them consistently, on CNBC or cited by the president. Which of our members can pick up the phone right now and talk to Joe Biden and talk to President Trump, right? That's where we need to start breaking through and they start recognizing us because we've accomplished, but we need to be more curious about what we can do to achieve greatness.
Let me follow up with that in terms of when you ran for governor, do you feel that Asian Americans are treated different when they run for president or when they run for governor? Is there something that there's a barrier that's still there where we're not recognized as really leaders?
So the answer is yes, right? When we did that polling, part of this is people vote for people they're comfortable with. And so when they're not used to having APIs in their lives, right, it's not part of their social fabric, you have to prove. Some of the polling is when individuals found out about where I stood on issues, they were comfortable, but it took a long time among especially people of other ethnicities. John is the oldest son of immigrant parents who struggled, right? He understands the values of immigrants, right? He fights for education. I have a background bringing people together. So we have to make sure we get out that story. And then part of it is, who do we get to participate? Mainly you, Lily, Paul, Stuart, Andrew, Buck, Ken, and others were helpful on my campaign, right? But we need, C100 and others to say, we want to take charge and continue to build coalitions with other groups so that this message is not only our message, this is America's message. We need people, so I was so proud of people of all colors and backgrounds and ages protesting against what happened to George Floyd and to bring a better moral compass to America, right? That's happened to the API community for a long, long period of time. So we need justice for our community also.
Also, John, I found, and you can agree or disagree with my assessment, I found when Asian Americans run for office, especially for very high office, whether it be president or US Senate, we always have to prove ourselves twice as hard with our own community that we can win.
Yeah, I just say generally, we have to work 10 times as hard for 1/4 the credit. And it's ridiculous. We ought to give applauded to extraordinary leaders. Following me is Evan Lowe. Evan, I think for the API caucus is the legislative champion for the API community, making sure that our voices are being heard. It's absolutely outrageous in Sacramento where you could have a piece of legislation trying to bring greater diversity to corporate boards. And that initial draft of that legislation excludes Asians. We have suffered and we have struggled so hard just to be a participant in the game, and for others to not to have us as an afterthought is still a punishing practice in the governance of which should be the leading state, California.
You know, John, I'm going to ask you a question that so many people ask me about you because they know how close we are. And the question is, are you through with running for elected office, or you're still going to be running and still going to be pursuing elected office? Because so many people ask me that. Is John going to still be able to run for office? Do you still have that passion?
Well, thank you. So I'm open. I love what I do. So mine is I want to make a difference in people's lives in the most impactful way. So today I serve on 3 corporate boards, 2 corporate advisory boards. I'm a fellow for this upcoming semester at the University of Southern California Center for Political Economy. So we'll have a whole bunch of gatherings talking about the presidential race. But the issues that I worked on in public office, the publicly traded company is healthcare. What I did in the Treasurer's Office, investment and trying to do economic development for small business, I do it with Pasadena Private Finance, trying to get them the financial instruments to help them do better. The pushing technology, I sit on a cybersecurity company and an anti-money laundering technology company. And then I've been invited for a few more corporate boards. So I'm going to continue to go on that front. I do want to have everybody, as I mentioned, the great story, the plug Mei Li's book. It says, "I'm not who you think I am." Right, that title basically shares our message. We need Americans to get a deeper sense of not only Asian Americans, Asian Pacific Islander Americans, but each other. At this time of great need and great struggle and global competitiveness, America would do much better if they listened to its Asian Pacific Islander community, right? Our connections back to Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, China, and elsewhere, Germany, Iceland, to be the highest performing economy in the world and to have the worst performance of all countries with this pandemic demonstrates the narrowness and ignorance exercised by a lot of our public officials.
Thank you, John. And I guess the audience can understand now why I constantly hear the cry that we need John Chung back in public office. Thank you so much, John, for sharing these thoughts with us.
Love to you, Mei Li. Bye-bye.
There you are. Our next guest is Evan Lowe, and I have to tell you, I guess you heard what John said about you too, Evan. The California Asian elected officials are such a tight family of super achievers. And I think I have to say, Evan was destined to be a political star. He became the first youngest Asian American to ever win an elected office at the age of 26. He became mayor of a city. And then he becomes the youngest Asian American state legislator at the age of 31. So whenever there's a discussion of an Asian rock star that represents this bright millennial generation, the name Evan Lowe is bound to come up. And Evan's district is actually Silicon Valley. And he made an immediate hit in the legislature when he was so successful in serving as the link between Silicon Valley, bringing them closer to the legislature, and the legislature close to Silicon Valley, so that there was a deeper understanding of the needs. And in fact, Evan is the chair of the Technology and Innovation Legislative Caucus. And if that's not enough, as being one of the most popular legislators in California State Assembly, and I think the Senate too, this year, Evan also served as the national co-chair of Andrew Yang's presidential campaign. Welcome, Evan. I start off.
Maylee, it's so wonderful to see you.
Thank you. I'm starting off with each of the interviewees by saying, what was your aha moment that made you decide, because I know you come from a family of dentistry, to seek a career in politics and public service?
Well, as a bad Chinese son, I did not become a doctor like my father had hoped to do, but I can play one in the legislature. But frankly, Maylee, it's because of people like you, John, Betty, and so many others that have come before us that have paved the way for people like me. And I'm a product, frankly, of the institutions that you and so many others have helped develop with respect to the infrastructure and the pipeline development. And it was that of my upbringing through a poly, in which in Silicon Valley, it's the Asian Pacific American Leadership Institute, run by Michael Chang and people like Paul Fong, who invested in Asian American engagement in our society. And I was a project of that and continue on as we lead today.
Thank you. You know, in 2009, you made history by becoming the youngest Asian American ever to be elected to public office. I'd like to hear about your experiences and challenge, because there's so many young millennials who are now following in your path. But what challenges did you face?
Well, running, as I told you, oftentimes seen as a perpetual foreigner. I'm a fourth generation Californian, speaking more Spanish than I do Chinese, but somehow I'm not seen as truly American. And I think similarly, as John made that sentiment about the perception of Chinese in America, that we are not quite truly American. And especially with this narrative and this rhetoric that somehow we have the Kung flu or the Wuhan virus, or that we are spies. And that's why it's so important that we engage. We are seeing today federal legislators in the United States Senate introducing legislation that will ban international students from China from studying in these United States. And we think about the level of intensity of a modern day Chinese Exclusion Act, and frankly, the lifeblood of Silicon Valley and the foreign talent that we need in terms of the economic engine, that's of a critical impact to us. And so the question should be, what is our response? And that's why it's important to have people like Betty Yee, John Chung, Andrew Yang, Kamala Harris, a wide variety of us to be in positions to be able to be at the table and say, no, this is not the American way. These are not American values, but also to reaffirm the importance of our own American history. And that's why ethnic studies is so important, that to remember our own Asian American and Chinese history.
Absolutely. And I want to comment to a comment that I'm seeing on the chat. And when we talk about Asian Americans, we're talking about Asian Pacific Islanders. It means the Filipinos, the South Asians, the Vietnamese, and everybody. I see the inclusiveness of Asian Pacific Islander Americans as so key to moving forward, as for our community to move forward, that we are all of one family. And I want to make a comment about that. You became co-chair of Andrew Yang's presidential campaign, and I'd like to have you describe your experiences as being part of this campaign, and what do you feel his campaign accomplished, Evan? And did you feel Yang's ethnicity hurt or help his candidacy?
Yes, I mean, let's also talk about some of the facts that might similarly existed, which was the question to say, well, Andrew Yang can't win. He's not going to win. Why would you join his campaign? And it's critical that we continually think about, it's always the first will pave the way. And it's important that we coalesce. If we as a community aren't even going to stand for our own, who's going to? And so being that, he oftentimes did not get equal airtime, in which he polls better than many sitting governors, congressional members, and didn't get adequate airtime, and that the mainstream media wrote him off. Similarly, it was not necessarily the Asian Pacific Islander community nor the Chinese community that helped push him with respect to fundraising to get him to the place where he needed to be. But similarly, it's also a sense of what does it mean to see someone like him be an active candidate and compete in a primary state like Iowa, which is predominantly 90% plus Caucasian. And what does that mean for us as a community? So I think absolutely it did have an impact negatively with respect to mainstream, because he wasn't taken seriously as a mainstream candidate. So how do we normalize that? And that's why Committee of 100 and so many of us, it's critical that we engage, and that I oftentimes say we fight our weight class, that we advocate and we represent us in a predominant way and demonstrate the type of influence that we should have in government, in media, in the economy, in business, all across the spectrum.
Thank you. Evan, I see a question that you've been faced with in California with regards to Prop 16. And it's a question from Aaron Chu. And I'm glad that Aaron posed this question, because it's something that has faced our community, and it has to do with, let me read it. There seems to be a huge gap between Chinese Americans who are born and raised in the US or who have been here for more than 20 years, and those who come from the immigrant generation in understanding the importance of affirmative action and what political mobilization is. It looks like there are different understandings of what privilege and racism is in both groups, and this is a cause of the gaps. How can we close these gaps and ensure there is more cohesiveness in understanding of the importance of these issues? Thank you, Aaron, for that question.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair one, which is what I referenced earlier with respect to ethnic studies and understanding our culture. Meili, you know this, but for viewers, I had significant protests. I knew the political perils, frankly, that representing a region with a strong number of Asian Pacific Islanders, in which my predecessor arguably lost his election, much to the fact that he did support affirmative action. So what was important is this, that recent immigrants may not be as familiar with the history of the California Alien Land Law of 1913, which prohibited Asian Americans from owning property, or that of the Chinese Exclusion Act, or the coalition of which Asian Pacific Islanders worked with that of the Latino community, the African American community, the LGBT community. So the coalitions are so important within the reality of politics and democracy. And if we just look at it from a protectionist standpoint, what's in it for the best interests of us solely, we will lose. And it's important that we recognize the fact that we are in a democracy working with many coalitions, which is equally important. Meili, I also want to mention this, which is to say there are many groups that go out and march for a variety of reasons, whether or not it's the Women's March in March, working and marching on the streets for themselves, for the choice of themselves. Black Lives Matter, Gay Pride for LGBT Heritage Month of equality, seeing the Latino community marching on the streets for immigration reform. And then you ask this question. Every other community goes out in the streets and marches, but what is the one singular issue that we as a community, as Asian Pacific Islanders, or even Chinese, what do the Chinese go and march for on the streets? And we seem to be lost with answering that question. So it just goes to show the complexity that exists within American society with respect to our community and our culture. But it just goes to reaffirm also the importance of us to be coalition building with others, so that when we need help and we see an attack on us like the Kung Flu, or that we're spies, we can see our Black and brown brothers and sisters fighting with us and saying that this is not right, this is about social justice.
It gives me a follow-up question too, because Evan, you and I have always discussed the need for Asian Americans to step up their game. John mentioned this a little bit, but we'd like to hear from you, because you represent, not that John is that old, but you represent the millennial generation. And the need for Asian Americans, Asian Pacific Islander Americans, to step up their game, to be more relevant and prominent to politics and mainstream society, to kind of equal the playing field of that of other ethnic communities and special interest groups. And how do you think that a prominent and distinguished organization like C100 can play a role in empowering the voice of Asian Americans in this country?
Well, we lack the cohesiveness of infrastructure. If you think about other communities, there might be the NAACP, there might be NALEO for the Latino community, and many other community-based organizations, the LGBT community, Human Rights Campaign. We as a community don't have that type of advocacy of a one-stop shop that does the type of policy making and advocacy, grassroots, organizing, the political action. And that's what I think is really important for us to be engaged with this, because we know that we are under attack. We'd be fooling ourselves if we didn't see that. We again talked about that with the current COVID crisis, with that of the trade issues with China, and potentially the attack on the notion of American exceptionalism when China becomes #1 in terms of GDP and America #2. What does that mean for Chinese Americans living in the United States? And I'm telling you, from the vantage point that I'm in on the front lines of the public realm, and seeing that of the vantage point of the Andrew Yang campaign, we still have a challenge with respect to demonstrating our patriotism. And this is unfortunate, but that's just the reality that we're dealt with. And so we must double our efforts and recognize that we must engage politically, as unsavory as it might be, because that's what will help advance us and moving forward, so that we can see a normalization of a Chinese American running for president of the United States.
I have another question, Evan, from Lloyd Feng, who said, what do you feel is particularly special about the pipeline of Asian American Chinese Americans in California, aside from the large numbers of AAPI and Chinese Americans? Why doesn't this pipeline exist as robustly in other states with large populations of AAPI and Chinese Americans?
Well, mainly you and I have talked about this before. We don't have that Jesse Jackson or that huge civil rights leader that can utilize the mechanisms of the carrot and the stick, which is to say that when there is a corporation that needs to be held to account with 0 boards of directors representing the Asian Pacific Islander community, where is it of that protest to demand an audience with that CEO? Where is it the demand for justice? Those are the types of things that it's important for us to develop. And I think the infrastructure building will be critical to allow for us to be intentional and to invest on the various mechanisms that will get us to be equipped with the political influence that we deserve, that we demand. But until we get to that point, we will just be getting the crumbs. So we must be able to fight similarly as other communities do, replicate opportunities of success, and not just be that quiet Asian, but to fight and be out there and be uncomfortable and be on the front lines. But we need that cavalry. And that's where so many of individuals, C100 and others, can help invest. We must put our resources into the investment of the infrastructure and not be afraid to get political.
Can you define a little bit more, Evan, what you mean by infrastructure?
Well, we don't have an organization to which can point blank go to bat and say, we're going to invest millions of dollars in voter registration specifically to Asian Americans. There is no apparatus that will hold both parties accountable to take on the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, say, what's your platform with respect to issues impacting the Asian Pacific Islander community? Who is going to be the backstop to argue that Hollywood is not, we are not seeing enough Asian Pacific Islanders in the areas of media? Who's going to hold our Fortune 500 companies accountable in keeping track to say, shame on you if you do not hire and have our individuals in C-suites, and if you don't, we're going to protest, we're going to write op-eds, we're going to do social media campaigns against you, we're going to boycott your company. These are areas of success in which we've seen, frankly, the LGBT community doing very well. If you see a company investing in anti-LGBT positions, we'll boycott Chick-fil-A. We will protest and try to stop you every single way, Boy Scouts in other ways. So there's opportunities for us to rectify the situation if we come together and build the infrastructure to allow us to do so.
And I think a lot has to do with our culture too, Evan, where we're taught not to protest. We're taught not to make waves. And it's something we're going to have to overcome if we're going to live in this society where that's how you make things happen. we have to overcome some of those barriers. One final question, Evan, and I hope everybody can see why Evan is such a rock star. The passion, the energy, that's very contagious when you get to know someone like Evan Lowe. As one of the brightest fourth generation Asian American elected officials in this country, the perpetual question that we are all faced with is when can we and how can we prove we are simply Americans and not foreigners?
And that's what this discussion is all about. We are seen as a perpetual foreigner. And as I shared with you earlier, Meili, when I first ran for office, I was 2 generations more native to my community than the sitting mayor, but yet I was seen as not truly American. Or whether or not I run for office and continually being asked, who are you more loyal to in the Olympics? Who are you rooting for? The United States or Japan? And of course, I'm Chinese American, speaking more Spanish. So this is something that of the realities that we're dealt with. But rather than being frustrated and running away from it, let's run towards it. Let's coalesce. Let's have deep conversations about shared power. Let's have difficult conversations about recognizing the racism even in our own community, especially during Black Lives Matter, and find out strategic ways to build partnerships so that we can also find ways to elevate our positions in our community throughout the fabric of society and making sure that the tapestry of talent is represented within our diverse communities. And that's how we solve this, and we'll do this together. So we're not going to solve this overnight, but surely we can come together.
And I'm not going to let you go, Evan, until you tell us what are some of your future aspirations, because as far as I'm concerned, you're just starting.
Well, you're too kind. Meili, I'm riding on your coattails. Let's be very clear about that. Well, again, I share with you, this is very genuine and honest. I don't see myself as a politician. I don't see myself that I'm an introvert, but yet every single day when I turn on the TV and I see the news about whether or not the wildfires or COVID or what's going on in the world, how can I not? It's easy to just turn away and be apathetic, but rather I want to run towards it. But I am only one person and I will come and go. So please, for those of you seeing this, see this as a call to action. Let's connect on Twitter, social media. I'd love to talk to you about getting your engagement further. A huge shout out to all that you have done for me, Meili, because I am sincerely following in your footsteps. As a good Chinese boy, I always think about recognizing and showing respect to our elders, and you of course are doing that. And also a huge shout out to Committee of 100 and dear friends Janie Fong, Kieran, I know that you're also watching as well.
Thank you. And if you, one word of, you've given so many inspirational messages, but you represent the millennial generation. You are our future, Evan. So in speaking to your community out there, your generation, what are some of your final words other than what you've just said? The final words to get this generation going to understand that we are now waiting for them to take over.
Yeah, and I think it's just calibrate our thinking of our culture. Yes, my grandmother, my mother told me, put your head down, do a good job, and you'll be handsomely rewarded. That, keep quiet, don't cause too much trouble. But we heard about this earlier from the tribute of Congressman John Lewis. Get into some good trouble. And how do we wake up each and every day to think about how are we investing in each other's shared success? So what am I, Evan Lowe, doing each and every day to do things to help others? And similarly, how do they help me? Let us be intentional about being interconnected with each other in the fabric of society and ensuring that our Chinese community is respected by our God-given obligation and our right to be respected as we should in the American society.
Thank you, Evan. And thank you for taking the time to be our guest. I'm inspired. I'm ready to go on the other generation. Thank you so much. And,
thank you.
I want to thank everyone for tuning in to this hopefully inspiring discussions with 3 terrific role models in public service who represent us in California. And thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it.